Chapter 1. Shadows over Devonshire Manor. It was a damp and foggy autumn evening when the persistent clatter of a hansom cab announced an unexpected visitor at 221B Baker Street. The ancient gaslights flickered against the cobblestones, casting elongated shadows that danced along the walls of the quiet street. Dr. John Watson, ever the observer of human behaviour, was peering out of the window, lost in thought, when the door to their lodgings swung open. In strode Mr. Sherlock Holmes with an unmistakable urgency about him, his eyes alight with the gleam of unspoken mysteries. "Watson, my dear fellow," Holmes began briskly as he unwrapped the soaked cloak from his shoulder. "Tonight, destiny has conspired to lead us into a conundrum that promises both perplexity and excitement." Watson, ever prepared to be swept into his friend's ventures, rose immediately from his armchair. "What news brings you in such haste, Holmes?" he inquired, fastening his own coat around him. Holmes paced slowly across the room, his keen gaze shifting to the scattered notes on the table. "A letter, Watson," he said, holding it aloft, postmarked from Devonshire. "A matter concerning a vanishing heiress from the illustrious Devonshire family, an occurrence that defies both logic and convention." Watson's brow furrowed in curiosity. A disappearance? But surely in a household of such standing, security would be impenetrable, especially within the confines of a locked room. Holmes smiled thinly, as if privy to an unspoken secret. "That is precisely the paradox, my friend. It appears that the heiress, Miss Eleanor Devonshire, has vanished from her own bedroom, a room locked from within by none other than herself. As with all matters that seem impossible, the truth hides beneath layers of deceit." A brief silence followed as the gravity of the case settled in. Holmes continued, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial murmur. "It is my hypothesis that the circumstances surrounding her disappearance are but a prelude to a far more intricate tapestry of familial treachery and hidden sins. This is no mere case of a wayward runaway, but rather a carefully orchestrated act designed to cloak deeper, more nefarious plots." Thus began the tale that would lead our heroes through twisting corridors of betrayal and blackmail. In the days that followed, the duo made haste to Devonshire Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the heart of the English countryside, its ivy-clad walls and manicured gardens belying the dark secrets that lay within. The manor, an imposing structure with turrets and sprawling wings, seemed to exude an air of aristocratic decay. Upon their arrival, Holmes and Watson were greeted by a sombre-faced butler, Mr. Fairweather, whose every movement betrayed a lifetime of servitude shadowed by unspoken burdens. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am deeply obliged for your prompt presence," said Fairweather, his voice trembling slightly as he led the way through a labyrinth of corridors lit only by the occasional candle. "Miss Eleanor was found missing this very morning. Her chamber was discovered locked from the inside, and no sign of forced entry exists." Holmes listened intently, his eyes flickering with interest as he surveyed the manor's austere interiors. "Show us to the room, Mr. Fairweather," he instructed firmly. They ascended a grand staircase, the creaking wood underfoot echoing in the silence. The corridor that led to Eleanor's room was lined with portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow the pair as they walked. Finally, they arrived at a heavy oak door marked with an embossed family crest. Watson observed, "The security of this manor must be unparalleled, Holmes. How can one simply vanish?" Holmes' expression grew pensive as he reached for the ornate brass key that Mr. Fairweather produced from his pocket. "That, my dear Watson, is the question that propels us to uncover the hidden truth." With measured deliberation, the door swung open to reveal a room that was both elegant and suffused with an eerie stillness. Inside, the chamber bore the unmistakable traces of wealth. A canopy bed draped in luxurious fabrics, delicate porcelain on a vanity table, and an assortment of personal belongings arranged in a manner that spoke of habitual order. Yet, what struck Holmes most was the peculiar arrangement of items near the window. A half-opened letter, a feathered quill, and a diary whose pages were marked with hurried scribbles. As Holmes' eyes roamed the room, he remarked, "Observe, Watson, the care with which this room is arranged. It is as though the very act of disappearance has been planned in a manner both artful and deliberate. There is no sign of a struggle, no evidence of violence, only the subtle hints that the heiress wished to vanish without leaving the standard traces of a hurried flight. Watson crouched beside the diary, gingerly turning its pages. "Holmes, look at these entries. They are filled with descriptions of secret meetings and whispered conversations, references to a dark family legacy. Who among the Devonshires could be involved in such clandestine dealings?" Holmes knelt beside Watson, his eyes narrowing in scrutiny. This is a significant clue. The meticulous record of thoughts and feelings penned here suggests that Miss Eleanor was not the fragile, demure daughter of the Devonshire line as the public might believe. Instead, she was observant and possibly embittered by the inner workings of her family's affairs. Before Watson could press further, Mr. Fairweather interrupted the scene. "If I may, Mr. Holmes, there is another matter you should attend to. The family has gathered in the drawing room. They await your assessment." The drawing room was a large, sombre space adorned with heavy draperies and antique furniture that seemed to have witnessed centuries of secrets. Here, Holmes found himself facing an assembly of characters whose expressions ranged from overt grief to subtle disdain. Among them were members of the Devonshire family, each bearing an air of sophistication, yet their eyes betrayed underlying anxiety. Seated in an elevated chair at the head of the room was Lord Gerald Devonshire, the patriarch, whose stern features and imposing presence commanded immediate respect. Beside him sat his younger brother, Edward, whose nervous glances and fidgeting fingers told a tale of inner turmoil. Also present was a stately woman, Lady Margaret Devonshire, her gaze aloof yet filled with quiet sorrow. And then there was a dapper young gentleman, Miss Eleanor's fiancé, Mr. Charles Worthington, whose polished exterior barely concealed the tension of the situation. Holmes surveyed the room silently before addressing the assembly. "I have been informed that Miss Eleanor's disappearance occurred under most peculiar circumstances. A locked room with no sign of forced entry. I understand that there are whispers of secrets within this family, secrets that might cast shadows on your standing." Lord Gerald interjected sharply. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand the delicacy of our private affairs. Eleanor is our blood, and this matter is deeply personal." Holmes's eyes locked onto the patriarch. "Indeed, sir, but when personal matters overlap with public interest, the duty of a detective transcends familial bonds. I assure you that my inquiry is guided solely by the search for truth." Lady Margaret's voice, soft yet penetrating, broke the tension. "Truth, Mr. Holmes, is often a matter of perspective. The world outside these walls is harsh, and sometimes one must retreat from its demands. Perhaps Eleanor sought refuge in a place where the burden of our legacy could be left behind." Charles Worthington leaned forward, his tone edged with defensiveness. "I must add that I had arranged for her safety on this trip. I arranged a discreet route for her if ever she needed to escape the suffocating expectations of our society. But to vanish completely, I cannot fathom what would compel her to do so." Holmes paced slowly in front of the assembly, his hands clasped behind his back. "The details remain scarce, but allow me to recount what I have thus far. A meticulously secured room, evidence of careful planning left in the form of personal items, and a diary that hints at an inner conflict. It appears to me that Miss Eleanor may have orchestrated her own disappearance." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Lord Gerald's face flushed with anger. "How dare you suggest such insolence? Eleanor is our only hope for the future of the Devonshire legacy. For her to willingly disappear is unthinkable." Holmes raised a hand to forestall further argument. "I do not intend to cast aspersions, but merely to follow the evidence wherever it may lead. I have learned that even in families with impeccable public regard, hidden fissures often reveal themselves in times of crisis." Edward, who had been silent until now, spoke in a quiet but measured tone. "There are rumours, Mr. Holmes, rumours of misappropriated funds and secret alliances with unsavoury characters. Uncle Gerald's business practices have come under scrutiny, and some believe that the family's wealth may be built on unstable foundations. Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes as the detective's expression deepened with thought. "These are dangerous accusations, Mr. Devonshire. Yet I suspect that the threads of this mystery extend far beyond mere family squabbles." Holmes continued, "Miss Eleanor's diary, which I have perused, alludes to an awareness of financial impropriety and hints at a correspondence with someone whose identity has yet to be determined. It is conceivable that her disappearance was designed to expose certain dark corners of this household, corners where betrayal and corruption fester in silence." A heavy silence fell over the room as the assembled family members digested Holmes' words. It was clear that beneath the veneer of aristocracy lay secrets that threatened to unravel not only the Devonshire name, but the very fabric of their society. Later that night, as the drawing room emptied and the family retired to their quarters, Holmes and Watson were left alone in the dim light of the Manor's study. Holmes unfurled a map of the estate on a large table, marking the locations of every exit, hidden passage, and window. "This Manor," he mused, "is a labyrinth of potential escape routes. Miss Eleanor's method, or rather the illusion of method, lies in the careful manipulation of these physical boundaries." Watson leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "Do you think it possible that she might have used one of these secret passages to leave, thereby giving the impression of an impossible disappearance?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "It is a possibility that cannot be dismissed. However, the lack of disturbance in the room suggests that no physical exit was forced. The true puzzle may lie in the psychological strategy behind her actions. She planned every detail meticulously, down to the positioning of that letter and quill on the windowsill." Holmes then pointed to a narrow corridor on the map. "Notice this section along the west wing, an area seldom visited by the household staff. If Miss Eleanor had knowledge of the Manor's hidden corridors, she could have used this to her advantage. Yet, the act of vanishing from a locked room, leaving behind such a clear message in the form of her diary entries, indicates that she intended her disappearance to be a statement, a revelation of sorts." Watson asked, "A revelation aimed at whom, Holmes? Could it be that she wanted to expose someone's wrongdoing?" Holmes's eyes glittered with the thrill of the chase. "Precisely, Watson. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that Miss Eleanor's actions were meant to cast a glaring light on the unsavory activities within her family. In a world where appearances are paramount, a controlled disappearance might be the only method to compel those hiding dark secrets to come to the fore." As the night deepened, Holmes and Watson meticulously reviewed every scrap of evidence diary entries hinting at secret meetings, the careful placement of personal items, and even the subtle details of the room's decoration that might have been manipulated to misdirect any observer. With every passing moment, the case took on new dimensions, each as perplexing as it was intriguing. Holmes's mind raced with possibilities. Consider this, Watson. The fact that the door was locked from within implies that the person who disappeared did so willingly and with full knowledge of the security measures in place. An ordinary victim of abduction would leave behind signs of a struggle or forced entry. Instead, we have a calculated act of self-imposed isolation that then transforms into a public spectacle. Watson mused aloud. It is as though she wished to be both victim and victor, orchestrating the perfect disappearance to expose the rotten underbelly of her family's affairs. Holmes smiled at the observation. Indeed, Watson. In the annals of criminal endeavour and high-stakes deception, such a manoeuvre is both audacious and brilliant. The heiress, if I may call her that, has taken control of the narrative, turning her own vanishing act into a weapon against those who would abuse their power. Later, as dawn's pale light began to seep into the corridors of Devonshire Manor, Holmes found himself alone in the private study of Lady Margaret. She had, after all, expressed the utmost sorrow at Eleanor's disappearance. Yet there was an air of resignation about her, a tacit acceptance that something greater than familial duty was at play. Lady Margaret sat in a high-backed chair, a delicate handkerchief clutched in her slender fingers. Her eyes, red from sleepless nights, were fixed on a portrait of a young woman that hung above the fireplace. She was not the delicate flower that many believed her to be, Lady Margaret confided softly, her voice trembling. Eleanor was a keen observer, an individual of formidable intelligence. She saw the cracks in our facade long before anyone else did, and she was determined to bring them to light. Holmes regarded her with measured interest. It seems, Lady Margaret, that your niece was a woman of both passion and purpose. Her very act of disappearing may have been her final stand, a declaration against the injustices that plagued this family. Lady Margaret's eyes filled with unshed tears. I always feared that our name was tarnished by secrets best left hidden, but perhaps Eleanor believed that only through exposure could we cleanse the stain that had seeped into our very soul. Holmes leaned forward, his voice gentle yet insistent. The truth, as I have come to believe, is that Miss Eleanor was not a mere victim of circumstance. She was a strategist, and in her calculated retreat, she left us a breadcrumb trail. A trail that, if followed diligently, may reveal not only the identity of those responsible for the hidden crimes, but also a network of deceit that extends far beyond the boundaries of this manor. Watson, who had been quietly absorbing every word, finally interjected, "And what of her fiancé, Mr. Worthington? His concern seems genuine, yet there is an undercurrent of something more, a hesitation, perhaps guilt." Lady Margaret hesitated before answering. Charles was always a charming young man, but he carried secrets of his own. There were whispers among the servants, hints of his involvement in matters that could tarnish his reputation. It is possible that his attachment to Eleanor was more complicated than mere affection. The circumstances of their relationship might be entwined with the very scandal that prompted her disappearance. Holmes's gaze darkened with contemplation. It is this confluence of personal ambition, hidden transgressions, and carefully orchestrated events that makes this case so enthralling. The heiress has, in effect, set a trap. A labyrinth of deception meant to unmask those who would betray the trust of their kin and their country. With the morning sun now fully illuminating the study, Holmes rose from his chair, signaling the end of an exhausting but illuminating night. "Watson, we have only scratched the surface. The clues left behind by Miss Eleanor indicate that her disappearance is but the first act in a drama that promises to reveal corruption at the highest echelons of the Devonshire family. I intend to pursue every lead, however minute it may seem." Watson nodded, his voice resolute. "Then let us proceed, Holmes. The path is fraught with uncertainty, but if Eleanor's gambit is to reveal the truth, we must be the ones to uncover it." As the duo stepped out of the study and into the corridors of the manor, a sense of impending revelation hung in the air. The case of the vanishing heiress was already proving to be more than a mere disappearance. It was a meticulously crafted stratagem to expose long-buried family secrets, embezzlement, and betrayal. And in the shadows of Devonshire Manor, every whispered rumour, every furtive glance, promised that nothing was as it seemed. Thus, with minds sharpened by the mystery and hearts driven by a thirst for justice, Holmes and Watson embarked on a journey that would not only redefine the legacy of the Devonshire name, but also challenge the very nature of truth and deception. In the quiet determination of their footsteps, the stage was set for a confrontation with the dark undercurrents of wealth and power. A confrontation that would shake the foundations of a family built on secrets. Chapter 2. The Web of Intrigue. The crisp morning air that had greeted Holmes and Watson upon their departure from the study had long since given way to a determined hustle within the manor's ancient corridors. As the early rays of sunlight filtered through leaded windows, casting latticed patterns on time-worn walls, the detective duo embarked upon the next phase of their investigation, a search for evidence that might illuminate the dark recesses of the Devonshire household. Holmes, always methodical in his approach, had requested access to the manor's extensive library, a repository of knowledge and, as he suspected, secrets. The library was a cavernous room lined with towering shelves laden with leather-bound tomes, historical records, and personal diaries of generations past. The air was redolent with the musty scent of aged paper and the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco. Watson followed closely behind Holmes, who immediately began scanning the spines of the books, his mind racing with hypotheses. "Watson," Holmes murmured, pausing before an ancient ledger, "these records contain not merely the financial dealings of the Devonshire family, but also hints of clandestine transactions that predate even the current crisis. See here, a series of entries detailing sums that defy logical explanation and references to secret accounts hidden from the public eye." Watson leaned in to examine the ledger. "Holmes, do you suppose that these irregularities are connected to the recent rumours of embezzlement? It seems that even before Eleanor's disappearance, there were whispers of fiscal impropriety within the family." Holmes' eyes gleamed with the thrill of a challenge. "Precisely, Watson. If the family's wealth is built upon hidden misdeeds, then the vanishing of Miss Eleanor might well be a calculated move to expose those very secrets. I intend to explore every entry, every faint clue that these pages might yield." The detective set about cross-referencing dates, names, and figures. His finger traced a particularly perplexing entry, a reference to a secret fund allocated for matters best kept in the shadows. The entry was signed by none other than Lord Gerald Devonshire himself, a fact that sent a shiver of foreboding through Holmes's mind. "Curious, isn't it?" he said quietly to Watson. "To find the patriarch's own signature on an account clearly intended to be hidden from scrutiny. One must wonder if he sought to protect himself from impending scandal, or if there is a deeper conspiracy at play." As they pored over the records, Holmes's attention was drawn to another detail. A series of cryptic notes written in a hurried scrawl, tucked between pages of an old family history book. The notes contained references to secret meetings, shadowy figures, and coded language that seemed to implicate multiple members of the household in unsavoury dealings. Though the handwriting was unmistakably that of Miss Eleanor, the messages hinted at alliances and betrayals that had yet to fully surface. Miss Eleanor was no passive bystander in her family's affairs, Holmes observed. Her diary and these scribbled notes reveal a keen intellect and an awareness of the rot festering within this household. It appears she was not content merely to be a silent observer of injustice. She was determined to bring it to light. As Holmes and Watson concluded their examination of the library's records, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of one of the Manor's long-serving staff members, a young maid named Beatrice. Her eyes darted nervously about the room as she hesitated before speaking in a barely audible whisper. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I beg your pardon for disturbing you, but there are things in this manor that even the highest ranks of our family cannot keep hidden," she said, her voice quivering with both fear and resolve. "There are whispers among the servants of secret passages, hushed conversations in the dead of night, and of forbidden meetings held behind closed doors." Holmes inclined his head, his tone both gentle and firm. "You have our assurance, miss." "Beatrice, sir," she replied, glancing around as if to ensure no one else could overhear. "I have long suspected that not all is as it seems within these walls. There is talk of a secret society, hidden alliances among some of the staff, and even, dare I say, certain members of the Devonshire family. I have heard tales of passages leading to concealed rooms and corridors that are not marked on any official map of the estate." Watson's brow furrowed with interest. "Miss Beatrice, do you know where these passages might be found?" She nodded hesitantly. "There is one passage, in particular, behind the tapestry in the east wing of the drawing room. I have seen the tapestry moved slightly on occasion, as if someone were checking to see if the way is clear. I cannot say more, for I fear reprisals, but I beg you to be cautious." Holmes's gaze was steady and unyielding. "Thank you, Miss Beatrice. Your cooperation is most valuable to us. Rest assured that any information you provide will be handled with the utmost care." After Beatrice departed, Holmes turned to Watson. "It appears that the secret passages mentioned in Miss Eleanor's diary may indeed be more than mere folklore. If she was aware of these hidden routes, she might have used them to her advantage, or even to trap those who would betray her trust." Watson nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. The servants often see more of the hidden workings of a household than even the masters dare to admit. We must follow up on this lead. Determined to investigate the servant's claim, Holmes and Watson made their way to the east wing of the drawing room. The richly woven tapestry that Miss Beatrice had mentioned hung regally on the wall, depicting an ancestral scene of valour and nobility. With a practiced eye, Holmes examined the borders of the tapestry, searching for any irregularities. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns along the edge. "There is a subtle discrepancy in the stitching, a small tear, almost imperceptible, that suggests repeated handling. This is no accident." Holmes' slender hand slipped behind the tapestry and tugged gently. With a muted creak, the tapestry swung aside to reveal a narrow, concealed doorway. Watson stepped back in astonishment as Holmes produced a small, ornate key from his coat pocket, a key he had found earlier among Miss Eleanor's personal effects. With deliberate precision, Holmes unlocked the door, revealing a dimly lit passageway beyond. The corridor was narrow and cold, its stone walls damp with the residue of years of neglect. Faint traces of old graffiti and faded symbols hinted at a history steeped in secrecy. "Here lies a passage known only to a few," Holmes remarked. "It is likely that Miss Eleanor utilized this hidden route not only to vanish from her locked room, but also to gather evidence against those who conspired against her." As they advanced cautiously down the corridor, the silence was broken only by the distant drip of water and the soft echo of their footsteps. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber, scarcely larger than a closet, where a lone desk and a flickering oil lamp created an atmosphere of clandestine meetings. On the desk lay a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon, the very same ribbon that had been seen earlier in the heiress's room. Holmes delicately untied the bundle and began reading one of the letters aloud in a low, deliberate tone. "Dearest Eleanor, the time has come to act. The secrets we harbour must be laid bare before our kin are consumed by corruption and greed. You must trust in the plan we have devised. This passageway shall be our conduit to truth, a path that leads to liberation from the chains of our ancestry. Yours in confidence, a friend in the shadows." Watson's eyes widened. A friend in the shadows? Who could that be? Holmes folded the letter carefully and set it aside. It appears that Eleanor was not alone in her quest for justice. Someone, perhaps a trusted confidant, was aiding her in orchestrating her disappearance and in exposing the rotten core of her family's empire. The fact that these letters were hidden in a secret chamber suggests that the conspiracies run deeper than we initially presumed. With this newfound evidence in hand, Holmes and Watson decided to expand their inquiry to the servants' quarters, a part of the manor that often held truths obscured by the polished facades of aristocracy. The servants, whose lives were interwoven with the daily operations of the manor, had witnessed events and heard whispers that no one else could. In a modest, sparsely furnished room near the kitchen, they encountered Mrs. Wilkins, the head housekeeper, a stern yet compassionate woman who had served the Devonshire family for decades. Her eyes, though weathered by years of labour, shone with an unmistakable clarity when she was questioned by Holmes. "Mrs. Wilkins," Holmes began, "I am aware that in households such as these, not all conversations are meant for the ears of the aristocracy. I have reason to believe that Miss Eleanor's disappearance may be linked to secrets hidden within these very walls. I seek your candour in matters that may appear unsavoury." Mrs. Wilkins hesitated for a moment before replying, "Mr. Holmes, I have seen things in this manner that would make any person's blood run cold. There have been late-night meetings in the halls, hushed voices behind closed doors, and even evidence of financial discrepancies in the accounts managed by some trusted family members." Watson interjected softly, "Are you referring to the secret accounts mentioned in the library records?" The housekeeper nodded gravely. "Yes, indeed. I have long suspected that Lord Devonshire's methods of managing the family's wealth were not entirely above board. Rumour has it that certain sums were diverted to accounts known only to a select few. I dare say even some of the servants are aware that these funds were used to pay off unsavoury characters, blackmailers perhaps, or those involved in other illicit ventures. Holmes' eyes narrowed. And were you aware, Mrs. Wilkins, of any connection between these financial irregularities and Miss Eleanor's actions? A deep sigh escaped her. I cannot say for certain, Mr. Holmes, but I have heard whispers that the heiress had discovered something damning about her uncle's involvement in these transactions. It is said that she was preparing to confront him about the misappropriation of funds that, according to some, were used not only for personal enrichment, but to facilitate more sinister endeavours. Holmes exchanged a thoughtful glance with Watson. It would appear that Miss Eleanor's disappearance may be less an act of desperation and more a calculated manoeuvre to force the hand of those entangled in corruption. Mrs. Wilkins's voice softened. I only hope that, in the end, the truth will prevail. This manor, for all its grandeur, has become a breeding ground for secrets that could ruin not only a family, but an entire legacy. After their interview with Mrs. Wilkins, Holmes and Watson returned to the manor's heart, a grand dining hall where the lingering aroma of a recently served breakfast mingled with the dust of neglect. Here, amidst the echoes of clinking silverware and the faint murmur of residual conversations, Holmes decided to confront the family members directly. He arranged a private meeting in one of the manor's smaller drawing rooms, away from prying eyes. Seated around a polished mahogany table were Lord Gerald Devonshire, his brother Edward, and the dapper Mr. Charles Worthington. Their expressions were a mix of defiance and apprehension as Holmes laid out the evidence gathered thus far. Gentlemen, Holmes began, the threads of this case weave a tapestry of deceit and betrayal that implicates more than one member of this household. The secret ledger, the hidden letters, and the passageway. Each is a piece of the puzzle that is Miss Eleanor's disappearance. I am compelled to ask, what do you have to say regarding the discrepancies in the family's accounts and the insinuations of illicit meetings behind these very walls? Lord Gerald's face hardened. Mr. Holmes, you speak of treachery as if it were rampant among us. I assure you, our financial dealings have always been conducted with the utmost integrity. Holmes's gaze did not waver, and yet evidence suggests otherwise. The very ledger that bears your signature, Lord Devonshire, refers to a secret fund, an account meant to conceal rather than reveal. Coupled with the testimonies of the servants and the correspondence found in the hidden passage, one must wonder if these funds were indeed allocated for nefarious purposes. Edward shifted in his seat, his voice tentative. There have been disagreements in the family regarding the management of our wealth, but to implicate us all in criminal activity is a grave accusation, one that I find hard to believe without further proof. Mr. Worthington, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. I must add that I too have my doubts about the official accounts of our family's finances. Eleanor confided in me on more than one occasion that there were secrets hidden behind the opulence of Devonshire Manor. However, I never imagined that such secrets would lead her to disappear, and to orchestrate her vanishing act as a means of exposing the truth. Holmes regarded them all with measured intensity. Your words betray a fear of exposure, gentlemen. A fear that the truth, once unmasked, would irreparably tarnish your reputations. Miss Eleanor's disappearance, I now suspect, was not a spontaneous act of defiance, but a deliberate move designed to force the hand of those who have long hidden their misdeeds in the shadows. A heavy silence followed his words as the gravity of the situation sank in. The assembled men exchanged uneasy glances, each aware that the web of intrigue was tightening around them. In the midst of the charged atmosphere, Mr. Charles Worthington excused himself from the table, citing the need for a moment of solitude. Holmes and Watson followed discreetly, finding him alone in a small antechamber. His normally composed demeanour was now marred by visible distress. Mr. Worthington, Holmes began quietly, your silence speaks volumes. You have been implicated in these accounts of financial misappropriation, and yet your concern for Miss Eleanor is unmistakable. Can you explain the nature of your involvement with the Devonshire finances? Worthington's eyes darted nervously. I did what I had to, Mr. Holmes. Eleanor was not a naive girl. She understood the undercurrents of this family's dealings. I too have been complicit in transactions that were intended to safeguard our future. But I never imagined that they would lead to murder, or that they would force her hand in such a drastic manner. Holmes's voice was low and incisive. Murder? You mention murder as if it were a mere footnote in your account of events. Elaborate, Mr. Worthington. Whose life was taken, and what part did you play? The young man hesitated, then confessed in a hushed tone. There was an incident, one that occurred during a time of intense dispute within the family. A trusted associate of my uncle was found dead under suspicious circumstances. I was there, trying to contain the situation, but the details have been obscured by the passage of time and the veils of secrecy. I fear that my involvement, however inadvertent, may have contributed to the chain of events that culminated in this tragedy. Watson, who had listened intently from the doorway, stepped forward. Mr. Worthington, are you suggesting that your presence at that fateful moment was more than mere coincidence? Worthington's eyes filled with remorse. I assure you, Dr. Watson, I had no desire for such an outcome. Yet in the tangled web of loyalties and betrayals, even the best of intentions can lead to unintended consequences. I loved Eleanor, and I only wished to see her safe. But now I am caught between loyalty to her and a duty to the truth, which is something I fear I may have compromised. Holmes placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. Your candor is appreciated, Mr. Worthington. Know that the path to redemption is paved with truth, however painful it may be. The evidence will reveal the full extent of each man's involvement in these dark dealings. That evening, as a storm began to brew outside the manor and the corridors echoed with the sounds of distant thunder, Holmes retired to his temporary quarters to re-examine the diary of Miss Eleanor. By the light of a flickering candle, he turned the pages with painstaking care, searching for clues that might consolidate the mosaic of clues he had gathered throughout the day. One entry, dated just days before her disappearance, caught his attention. I have resolved to act. The darkness that has seeped into my family's soul can no longer be tolerated. I will gather the evidence and expose the treachery that has festered behind the facade of respectability. To my secret friend in the shadows, know that the time is now. We shall be the architects of our own salvation. Holmes' voice trembled with a mix of admiration and sorrow as he read the words aloud to Watson, who sat nearby in silent contemplation. Miss Eleanor was not only aware of the corruption that had plagued her family for years, but had resolved to take matters into her own hands. The diary entry suggests a final plan, a means of ensuring that the truth would eventually emerge, no matter the cost. Watson added, it is as though she orchestrated everything, from her disappearance to the careful placement of clues, so that the rot at the core of the Devonshire legacy would be exposed. Her bravery, though tragic, is undeniable. Holmes closed the diary with a decisive snap. We must now piece together the remaining fragments of this puzzle. The clandestine meetings, the secret accounts, the hidden passage, each element is a deliberate stroke in a portrait of betrayal. And in that portrait, one figure looms larger than the rest. The patriarch himself, Lord Gerald Devonshire, whose desperate attempts to maintain a pristine image may have driven him to commit acts that are beyond redemption. A new lead. The uncle's incriminating ledger. In the days that followed, Holmes's investigation took him back to the library, where he discovered another volume, a ledger that did not belong among the official financial records. This ledger, hidden behind a false panel in one of the bookcases, contained entries that painted a damning picture of the family's dealings. Not only did it list vast sums transferred to anonymous accounts, but it also bore the unmistakable handwriting of Lord Gerald Devonshire. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he traced a series of entries that detailed payments made to a mysterious A.W., a set of initials that remained unexplained. The entries were meticulous and detailed, chronicling transactions that spanned years and suggesting an elaborate scheme of embezzlement and bribery. "This ledger," Holmes remarked to Watson as they pored over the faded ink, "is a smoking gun." Lord Devonshire appears to have orchestrated a network of financial deceptions using these secret funds to both enrich himself and to silence potential threats to his power. And it is possible that Miss Eleanor, in her final act of defiance, discovered this ledger and used it as leverage against those who would see the family's name tarnished. Watson, absorbing the gravity of the discovery, commented, "It seems that the disappearance of the heiress was not merely a personal escape, but a calculated maneuver to force the truth into the light. If her uncle is indeed involved in these embezzlements, then exposing him would bring ruin not only to his reputation but to the entire family." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, Watson. And yet, we must also consider the possibility that those who conspired with him, perhaps even those closest to Eleanor, might have had their own roles to play in this tragedy." In the subsequent days, Holmes and Watson methodically reassembled the scattered pieces of evidence. They revisited the hidden passage, re-examined the library ledgers, and re-interviewed the servants whose testimonies had provided tantalizing hints of conspiracy. Every fragment of evidence, every whispered rumor, coalesced into a narrative of calculated betrayal and audacious defiance. One rainy afternoon, while sitting in the dim light of the Manor's study, Holmes summarized his deductions to Watson. "Watson, we are witnessing the unraveling of a web spun with meticulous care. A web where loyalty, greed, and desperation are intertwined. Miss Eleanor's disappearance was a masterstroke of deception. By vanishing on her own terms, she has compelled her family, and indeed all who are entangled in these machinations, to reveal their true faces." Watson replied, "It is a dangerous game, Holmes, one in which every secret uncovered risks igniting conflicts that may be irreversible. Yet, in the pursuit of truth, sacrifices must be made, even if they are the dreams of a courageous young woman determined to expose a legacy built on lies." Holmes' gaze hardened with resolve. "We must now prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The family's carefully constructed facade is on the verge of collapse. Soon, the evidence we have gathered, the secret ledger, the hidden letters, the clandestine meetings, and the unmistakable clues left behind by Eleanor, will force those responsible to either come clean or face the consequences of their actions." As the investigation progressed, a palpable tension settled over Devonshire Manor. Whispers of suspicion and paranoia grew louder, and the once grand halls became battlegrounds for conflicting loyalties and hidden agendas. In private discussions among the servants, the name of Miss Eleanor was spoken with reverence, a symbol of hope and defiance against the oppressive weight of family secrets. One evening, as a storm raged outside and the Manor's windows rattled in the tempest, Holmes and Watson found themselves summoned once more by Mrs. Wilkins. In the flickering lamplight of a modest parlour, the head housekeeper revealed a crucial piece of information. "Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Wilkins began, her voice barely rising above the howl of the wind, "there is one more secret that I have guarded for many years, a secret concerning the true extent of Lord Devonshire's treachery. I have seen documents, hidden in the private study, that detail transactions not only with dubious characters, but with individuals whose names are synonymous with scandal and criminality." Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And where might these documents be found, Mrs. Wilkins?" She hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door. "They are kept in a locked drawer in Lord Devonshire's private study, a room to which few have access. I beg you to be cautious, for the repercussions of this truth being revealed could be catastrophic." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes as the detective's mind raced. "Mrs. Wilkins, your assistance in this matter is invaluable. We shall proceed with the utmost care." Under cover of darkness, Holmes and Watson made their way to the secluded private study of Lord Devonshire. The room was opulently furnished, a stark contrast to the grim corridors that lay beyond. In the centre of the room stood an imposing desk, behind which sat a portrait of Lord Devonshire, a constant reminder of the patriarch's influence. Holmes set to work examining the room with his customary thoroughness. Every drawer was inspected, every shelf scrutinized for hidden compartments. It was then that he discovered a false bottom in a mahogany desk drawer. With a careful tap and a gentle prod, he revealed a stack of documents bound together with a red ribbon, similar in hue to the one found in the hidden passage. These documents, Holmes said, his voice barely above a whisper, are the final pieces of the puzzle. They contain records of transactions that link Lord Devonshire not only to illicit financial dealings, but also to the machinations that may have led to the untimely death of a man, a murder that has haunted this family for far too long. As Holmes sifted through the papers, his eyes widened with realization. Watson, these records implicate not only my suspect, but also Mr. Worthington's involvement in the events leading up to that mysterious death. It seems that his presence at the scene was not coincidental after all, but part of a larger conspiracy that spanned years. Watson's voice was tinged with disbelief. So the very man who professed his love for Eleanor and sought to protect her was entangled in this web of deceit. His role, however inadvertent, may have been far more insidious than he ever intended. Holmes carefully organized the documents, preparing to confront the parties involved. We now stand at the precipice of a revelation that will shatter the carefully constructed illusions of this manor. Miss Eleanor's calculated disappearance was her final, brilliant gambit to expose the corruption that has infected her family. And in doing so, she has forced us to unmask those who would hide behind false facades. As the storm outside abated into a heavy, oppressive silence, Holmes and Watson reconvened in the drawing room. The evidence was irrefutable. A network of embezzlement, bribery, and even murder had been uncovered, with key players ensnared by their own greed and ambition. The revelation was not merely about financial impropriety. It was about the betrayal of trust, the sacrifice of an innocent soul for the sake of exposing the truth, and the inevitable downfall of those who believed themselves untouchable. Holmes addressed the assembled family members, his voice steady and resolute. The documents we have uncovered, coupled with the testimony of those who have served in this manner for generations, paint a picture of corruption that extends far beyond individual misdeeds. It is a portrait of a family built on secrets, greed, and a willingness to sacrifice honor for profit. Lord Gerald's face paled as he listened, his earlier defiance crumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence. Edward, who had once spoken so confidently, now sat in silence, his eyes reflecting the weight of guilt. Mr. Worthington's expression was a tortured mix of regret and resignation, an acknowledgement of the part he had played in events spiraling out of control. Miss Eleanor, Holmes continued, you orchestrated a disappearance that was, in truth, a meticulously planned campaign to force the truth into the open. Your courage in the face of betrayal, your determination to expose the rot at the heart of your family, will not be in vain. The path you chose was fraught with danger, but it was the only way to ensure that the sins of the past are brought to justice. A heavy silence filled the room as the implications of Holmes's words settled upon those present. The gathering storm of revelations promised that the confrontation with the true architects of this treachery was imminent. In the days that followed, as the manor prepared for the inevitable reckoning, Holmes and Watson remained steadfast in their resolve. The web of intrigue had been unravelled, thread by thread, and now each participant in this intricate drama would be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. For Holmes, the case of the vanishing heiress had evolved into a testament to the power of truth over deception, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, the light of justice would eventually prevail. For Watson, the journey had been a poignant exploration of loyalty, sacrifice, and the painful cost of uncovering long-buried secrets. As the final pieces of evidence were laid bare and the first steps toward accountability were taken, a sense of bittersweet vindication filled the halls of Devonshire Manor. Miss Eleanor's disappearance, a masterstroke of cunning and courage, had set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the legacy of the Devonshire name. And though the scars of betrayal would remain, They would serve as a reminder that even in a world rife with corruption, the pursuit of truth was a cause worth fighting for. Chapter 3. The Unmasking of Shadows. A pall of tension had settled over Devonshire Manor in the wake of the discoveries from the previous days. The storm that had battered the estate had subsided into an eerie stillness, as if the very air awaited the next move in a deadly game of secrets and betrayals. Inside the grand drawing room, the assembled members of the Devonshire household lingered in a state of uneasy anticipation. Their eyes were heavy with dread and uncertainty, a family held hostage by its own dark dealings. In this charged atmosphere, Holmes and Dr. Watson prepared to take their investigation to the next level, determined to uncover every hidden strand of deceit. After a sleepless night spent poring over the damning documents, Holmes convened a midnight assembly in the Manor's vast library. The room, usually a sanctuary of knowledge and calm, was now transformed into a chamber of secrets. Flickering candlelight cast long dancing shadows along the rows of leather-bound books, and the low murmur of hushed voices created an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Holmes, his eyes alight with resolve, addressed the gathered family members: Lord Gerald, his brother Edward, Lady Margaret, and even Mr. Worthington, who had come to terms with the consequences of his earlier confessions. "Gentlemen and Lady Margaret," Holmes began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "the evidence we have unearthed implicates more than mere financial mismanagement. We stand on the precipice of exposing a network of corruption and, dare I say, a murder that has haunted these halls for far too long." A heavy silence followed his words as each person wrestled with the implications. Lord Gerald's jaw tightened, and Edward's eyes darted nervously from one face to another. Even Lady Margaret, though composed, betrayed a hint of sorrow at the loss of trust that had bound their family together for generations. Holmes continued, "Yet I sense that a crucial element remains missing. A final piece that might reveal not only the perpetrators, but also the method by which these crimes were orchestrated." He paused, allowing the weight of his statement to settle. Miss Eleanor's disappearance was no act of mere despair or rebellion. I believe it was a calculated maneuver, designed to force the truth into the light. At these words, a murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Dr. Watson, ever the observer, noted that while some faces registered shock and indignation, others seemed to betray a strange sense of relief, as if the possibility of long-held secrets being exposed was both dreaded and anticipated. Later that night, while the family slept fitfully in their respective quarters, Holmes and Watson returned to the library. They had arranged to re-examine the documents and letters discovered in the hidden compartments earlier. The library, now cloaked in the deep hush of midnight, became their private sanctum of truth. The duo spread the documents across a large oak table, their expressions serious as they retraced every word and every line. Holmes's eyes rested on a letter addressed in flowing script that had been tucked away in one of the ledgers. Its contents were cryptic, a mixture of declarations of devotion and calls for secret meetings. "Watson, this letter," Holmes said in a hushed tone, "appears to be written by none other than Miss Eleanor herself. But there is more. The language she uses is that of calculated rebellion. She speaks not only of betrayal, but of a plan, a strategy that appears designed to unmask those who would hide behind a facade of respectability." Watson leaned forward, studying the yellowed paper carefully. "It mentions a rendezvous in a location known only to a few, doesn't it? A secret meeting to which only those truly in the know would be invited." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And I suspect that if we can decipher the coordinates or details hidden within these words, we may be able to predict her next move, or rather, the culmination of her grand design." The detective's fingers traced the faded ink, pondering the possibility that Miss Eleanor's disappearance was not a final escape, but a carefully choreographed maneuver to draw the corrupt into the open. At that moment, a soft knock came at the heavy door of the library. Holmes motioned Watson to be silent as he opened it just a crack. There, in the dim corridor, stood a figure cloaked in a dark shawl. a young woman whose eyes flickered with determination and secret knowledge. It was Beatrice, the maid who had earlier provided valuable information about the hidden passage. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, glancing around nervously before speaking, "I have brought something that might interest you." In her hands, she held a small, intricately carved wooden box. This box belonged to Miss Eleanor. I found it hidden in a corner of her room, concealed behind an old trunk. Holmes accepted the box with gentle reverence. "Thank you, Miss Beatrice. Your loyalty is commendable." He carefully opened the box, revealing its contents: a delicate silver locket, a faded photograph, and, most intriguingly, a small folded piece of paper covered in what appeared to be a cipher. Watson picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar script. "Holmes, this looks like a code, one that might require the very skills you are renowned for." Holmes' eyes glinted with anticipation. "Indeed, Watson. It seems that Miss Eleanor has left us one final riddle, a key to unlock the deeper layers of this mystery." For hours they laboured over the cipher, cross-referencing it with clues from the diary, the ledger, and the secret letters. Slowly, the hidden message began to reveal itself. A message that alluded to a clandestine meeting at a secluded glen in the estate's grounds at the stroke of midnight on the night of the next full moon. It was a summons, a final invitation for those who dared to confront the truth. The following evening, as the full moon ascended high into the starry sky, Holmes and Watson made their way discreetly out of the manor. Cloaked in darkness and armed with the revelations from the cipher, they set off toward the secluded glen indicated in the note. The path was treacherous, winding through overgrown hedgerows and ancient trees whose gnarled branches seemed to guard long-forgotten secrets. In the glen, under the pale luminescence of the moon, a small group had already gathered. Among them were figures who had long been hidden in the shadows of Devonshire Manor. The butler, Mr. Fairweather, a few trusted servants, and even a couple of individuals whose identities were ambiguous. It was clear that Miss Eleanor's network extended beyond the confines of her own family, uniting those who had suffered in silence or who had seen the corruption firsthand. Holmes and Watson observed from behind a copse of trees as a hushed conversation unfolded. At the centre of the gathering stood a woman in elegant attire, a figure whose presence commanded both respect and mystery. As she spoke, her voice was calm yet resolute. "Tonight, we stand at the crossroads of destiny. The sins of our past have been laid bare, and the legacy of our family is at risk of being irreparably tarnished. Miss Eleanor has shown us that even in the darkest of times there remains a glimmer of hope, a hope that truth will prevail and that justice, though delayed, is not denied." Holmes' brow furrowed in contemplation as he exchanged a meaningful look with Watson. The words of this mysterious woman resonated with the very essence of the case, a truth that the heiress had engineered to expose the festering corruption of the Devonshire family. Was it possible that she was here, present among these loyal followers, watching from the shadows as her plan reached its zenith? Watson murmured, "Holmes, could it be that Miss Eleanor is not a victim at all, but the mastermind behind this entire conspiracy?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with a mixture of admiration and astonishment. "That, Watson, is a theory that cannot be dismissed. Consider the precision of her actions, the disappearance, the hidden messages, the intricate planning. It suggests not despair, but deliberate strategy. We must tread carefully, for we are now on the brink of an unmasking that could change everything." The following day, after the clandestine midnight meeting, tensions within Devonshire Manor reached a fever pitch. Whispers of betrayal and conspiracy echoed through the corridors, and every face seemed to harbour secrets too heavy to bear. In a decisive move, Holmes summoned a select few, the very individuals whose loyalty and courage had shone through during the midnight assembly and the gathering in the glen. In a dimly lit room set aside for private counsel, Holmes, Watson, and several trusted confidants assembled to review the evidence. Among those present was Mrs. Wilkins, whose decades of service had earned her a reputation for discretion and forthrightness, and Mr. Fairweather, whose eyes betrayed both loyalty and sorrow. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as Holmes began to lay out his deductions. Each document, each hidden letter, each secret passage in this manner is a deliberate stroke on the canvas of deception, he stated, pacing slowly before the group. Miss Eleanor's actions, her disappearance, and the cryptic messages left behind all point to a single, radical purpose: to expose the rot that has long festered within this family. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. Mrs. Wilkins, her voice steady despite her evident distress, spoke up. I have known for many years that the wealth of this family was built on dubious foundations. I have witnessed transactions that defied propriety and seen how those in power would silence anyone who dared question their authority. Holmes continued, "The documents we have uncovered reveal that not only was Lord Gerald involved in embezzlement and bribery, but that he conspired with others, indeed, even those closest to Miss Eleanor, to commit acts that have forever marred the legacy of the Devonshire name. Her disappearance was not an act of weakness, but one of profound courage. By removing herself from the immediate equation, she forced the corrupt to reveal themselves. It was then that Mr. Fairweather, his voice trembling with emotion, interjected, 'There is one truth that I have guarded, one secret that has tormented me since the day I joined this household. I was once privy to a conversation between Lord Gerald and one of his most trusted advisers, a conversation that spoke of a contingency plan should the truth ever come to light. They spoke of the final sacrifice and of using the family's reputation as a shield to cover their crimes.' Holmes's gaze sharpened. And what of Mr. Worthington? His role in the tragic events and his apparent remorse have not escaped my notice. He has been a man torn between loyalty to Eleanor and the destructive ties of this corrupt enterprise. Mr. Worthington, who had been silent in the corner, stepped forward with visible anguish. I confess, I was complicit in the actions that led to the untimely death of a man. A death that was as much a product of the family's greed as it was of my own misguided attempts to control a situation that spiraled beyond my command. I loved Eleanor, and in my love I sought to protect her. I was ensnared in a web of promises and threats, and I now bear the weight of my actions every moment." Holmes's voice was firm, yet compassionate. "Redemption is found in the truth, Mr. Worthington. By coming forward and sharing your role in these events, you have taken the first step towards atonement. But the final truth remains elusive, a truth that must be uncovered by reconciling every piece of evidence with the hidden intentions behind Miss Eleanor's disappearance." Watson added quietly, "It appears that she faked her own disappearance. All the clues, the locked room, the secret passages, the coded letters, they point to a scenario where Eleanor orchestrated her exit, not out of fear, but to provide us with the means to expose the corruption within her family." A collective gasp filled the room. The idea was as audacious as it was brilliant. Holmes continued, "Indeed, Watson, our very investigation has revealed that the heiress was not a helpless victim, but a visionary who chose to vanish on her own terms, leaving behind a trail of clues so intricate that only the most discerning of minds could follow them. She has turned her own disappearance into the greatest act of defiance against a legacy built on lies. In the days that followed, the manor became a crucible of revelations. Holmes and Watson revisited every hidden corner of Devonshire Manor, every secret ledger, every whispered conversation, seeking to reconstruct the true sequence of events. In doing so, they uncovered one final set of documents that had been carefully concealed in a locked cabinet within Lord Gerald's private study, a cabinet that had long been avoided by the household staff. Inside were letters and detailed records that traced the flow of illicit funds from the Devonshire accounts to offshore hideaways, as well as evidence linking the mysterious A.W. mentioned earlier to a figure whose identity was obscured by layers of aliases. The records detailed payments for services rendered that were both unaccounted for and damning in their implications. The documents painted a picture of a well-organized network, one that extended its tendrils far beyond the immediate confines of the manor. Holmes gathered his trusted confidants once again. "These documents leave little doubt," he said gravely. "Lord Gerald, in his fervent desire to protect the family's reputation, has engaged in financial and even criminal activities that have endangered the lives and honour of those who serve this estate. And it is clear that Miss Eleanor, in her disappearing act, intended to reveal this web of deceit. She manipulated the very symbols of our domestic world, the locked door, the hidden passages, the secret ledgers, to construct a narrative that exposes her family's dark heart. As the evidence was laid bare, it became increasingly evident that the carefully constructed facade of the Devonshire legacy was crumbling. The news of the investigation had spread, and whispers of scandal began to seep beyond the manor's walls. Local newspapers hinted at a major breakthrough in what was being called the Devonshire conspiracy, and it was only a matter of time before the entire community would demand accountability. It was in the twilight hours of a crisp autumn evening that the final confrontation took shape. In the grand hall of Devonshire Manor, the assembled family and key members of the household gathered for what was to be an irrevocable reckoning. Lord Gerald stood at the head of the room, his face a mask of grim resignation and barely concealed rage. Beside him, Edward and Mr. Worthington exchanged anxious glances, while Lady Margaret maintained a dignified sorrow that belied the turmoil within. Holmes stepped forward, every eye upon him. "The time for obfuscation is over," he declared. "I have before me irrefutable evidence that implicates not only those who have misappropriated the family's wealth, but also those who have conspired to silence the truth at any cost. Miss Eleanor's disappearance was a deliberate act, a sacrifice made in the pursuit of justice. She believed that by vanishing, she could force your hidden transgressions into the light." A stunned silence followed as Lord Gerald's features contorted with indignation. "You dare accuse me of treachery?" he thundered, his voice echoing against the stone walls. Holmes met his glare unflinchingly. "I present you with the ledger bearing your signature, the documents detailing illicit transactions, and the confession of those entangled in this network of deceit. The evidence is clear. The legacy of the Devonshire name has been built on a foundation of corruption, and Miss Eleanor has paid the ultimate price to expose it." At that moment, from the back of the hall, a soft yet commanding voice interjected, "Perhaps it is time we hear from the true architect of this plan." All eyes turned as the mysterious woman from the glen stepped forward. Clad in attire that blended the elegance of aristocracy with the air of a rebel, she revealed herself to be none other than Miss Eleanor Devonshire herself. A collective gasp filled the hall. For a long moment, silence reigned as every face registered disbelief and astonishment. Holmes' eyes shone with both admiration and relief as he addressed her. "Miss Devonshire, so you were the mastermind all along?" Her expression was resolute, yet tinged with sadness. "I had no choice," she explained, her voice clear and unwavering. "To cleanse our family of its sins, the truth had to be forced into the open. I faked my disappearance, orchestrating a trail of clues that only the most determined minds could follow. I did this not for personal gain, but for the sake of justice. I could not allow our legacy to be defined by greed and corruption." Lord Gerald's face paled, his anger giving way to a look of abject defeat. Edward trembled as he realized the extent of the deception that had pervaded their lives. Mr. Worthington bowed his head, remorse evident in every line of his face. "Miss Devonshire," he whispered, I... She held up a hand to silence him. "No words are needed now. The evidence is before you. My disappearance was a means to an end, to expose the rot that has festered in this household for too long. I implore you all to face the truth, however painful it may be, and to begin the process of atonement." Holmes stepped forward and, with the authority of truth born of meticulous investigation, declared, "Let this be a turning point. The Devonshire legacy, tarnished by years of deceit, must now be rebuilt on the foundation of honesty and accountability. Justice will be served, and those responsible for these crimes shall not be allowed to continue their reign of corruption. As the confrontation unfolded, the storm of secrets that had long tormented Devonshire Manor began to subside. The truth, painstakingly unearthed by Holmes, Watson, and the brave few who had chosen loyalty over fear, had emerged victorious. The Manor's grand hall, once filled with whispered conspiracies and veiled threats, now resonated with the promise of reform. In the days that followed, law enforcement was summoned and, under the weight of the evidence, several members of the family and their accomplices were taken into custody. The scandal that rocked the Devonshire name was splashed across headlines, and the community, though shocked, began to rally behind the call for transparency and justice. Miss Eleanor, now stepping out from the shadows, resolved to remain an advocate for truth. Though she had borne the heavy cost of orchestrating her own disappearance, her actions had sparked a movement, a reckoning that promised to dismantle the legacy of corruption and replace it with a commitment to honour. In quiet moments, she confided in Holmes and Watson, "I never desired to be the villain of my own story. My hope was that, through my sacrifice, we might begin to heal the wounds inflicted by greed and betrayal." Holmes, his expression softening in rare moments of genuine empathy, replied, "Miss Devonshire, your courage has not only unmasked the shadows that haunted this estate, but has also illuminated the path toward redemption. In every mystery there is a lesson, and your lesson is one of resilience and unwavering pursuit of truth." Watson added quietly, "In the end, it is the strength of character that defines a true hero. Your actions have shown that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, a single light can guide us to a new dawn." As Devonshire Manor began the long and arduous process of reconciliation and reform, the legacy of the family would be rewritten, one page at a time, by the pen of truth and the hands of those who had dared to defy the corruption that had once reigned unchecked. The investigation, now drawing to a close, left behind scars that would take time to heal. Yet amidst the ruins of deception, there was a palpable sense of hope. Holmes and Watson, having once again traversed the labyrinth of human frailty and ambition, reflected on the nature of truth. Holmes mused, "In the shadows, deception may thrive for a time, but truth, when pursued relentlessly, inevitably rises." Miss Eleanor's ingenious act of self-exile was a testament to the power of conviction. Watson, ever the faithful chronicler, remarked, "It is not every day that one encounters a mystery so intricate, so laden with both sorrow and hope. In the end, it is our duty to honour those who risk everything for the sake of justice." And so, as the first light of dawn bathed the grounds of Devonshire Manor in a gentle glow, a new chapter began, one in which the legacy of the past would serve not as a chain, but as a lesson for the future. The vanishing of the heiress had been a ruse, a masterful stratagem to unmask the rot at the heart of a venerable lineage. In its wake, truth had been set free, and with it the promise of a better tomorrow. Fade out on the manor's facade as the camera slowly pans across the restored gardens and the rejuvenated halls, symbolizing not an end, but the hopeful beginning of a legacy reborn. Chapter 4. The Reckoning of Shadows. The storm had passed over Devonshire Manor, leaving in its wake a heavy calm that belied the turbulence simmering within its walls. In the wake of Miss Eleanor's dramatic revelation and the unmasking of secrets that had plagued the Devonshire legacy for decades, the manor now found itself at the crossroads of redemption and ruin. In the days that followed the midnight assembly and the confrontation in the Grand Hall, a palpable sense of reckoning settled over every corner of the estate. At dawn, a soft, misty light crept through the tall windows of the manor's drawing room. The once imposing faces of the family now bore expressions of defeat and quiet resignation. Lord Gerald, who had earlier raged against the accusations, now sat slumped at the head of the long table, his eyes vacant as he gazed at the scattered documents that had exposed his misdeeds. His brother Edward, normally a man of few words, stared silently at the floor, his hands trembling as if in silent protest of the truth laid bare. Even Mr. Worthington, whose inner conflict had been evident during the confrontation, now wore a mask of solemn regret. In a corner, Lady Margaret, her eyes rimmed with unshed tears, whispered softly to a trusted maid, "Is it possible that we can ever escape the stain of our past?" Her voice carried both despair and a desperate longing for absolution. Meanwhile, in a small study set aside for private reflection, Miss Eleanor, now revealed as the mastermind behind her own vanishing act, sat with a measured calm. Her face, though marred by the hardships of what had transpired, radiated a quiet strength. She had long known that the road to justice would be steep and unyielding, yet she remained resolute. The weight of her secret sacrifice pressed upon her, but so too did the hope that, in time, the truth would heal the wounds inflicted by corruption and greed. It was in this charged atmosphere that Holmes and Watson convened to review the next steps in the quest for justice. They met in the library once more, a room that had borne silent witness to the unravelling of a vast conspiracy. The scattered documents, secret letters, and ledger entries lay like pieces of a broken puzzle across a polished oak table. Holmes, ever meticulous, paced slowly as he contemplated the evidence. "Watson," he began, his voice low and resolute, "the truth we have unearthed cannot remain hidden in the corridors of this manor. The corruption that has festered here for generations demands accountability. We must ensure that those responsible face the consequences of their actions. This is not merely a matter of personal vengeance. It is a crusade for justice and the restoration of honor." Watson, his eyes reflecting both admiration and concern, nodded. "Indeed, Holmes. The path ahead is fraught with peril, not only for those who have erred, but also for the innocent souls caught in the crossfire of greed. But if we stand firm in our pursuit of truth, there can be no turning back." The revelations at Devonshire Manor had not gone unnoticed in the wider community. Whispers of scandal and corruption had spread like wildfire beyond the estate's boundaries, reaching the ears of local magistrates and law enforcement officials. By mid-morning, a contingent of officers and investigators arrived at the manor, their presence a tangible reminder that the era of unchecked power and subterfuge was coming to an end. Holmes had long maintained a discreet line of communication with Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, and within hours, a formal investigation was launched. The assembled officers, armed with copies of the incriminating documents and witness testimonies gathered from servants and family members alike, began to systematically secure the manor and its records. Their stern faces and deliberate steps contrasted sharply with the once proud, haughty demeanour of the Devonshire patriarch. In a makeshift command centre set up in the manor's grand hall, Inspector Lestrade reviewed the evidence alongside Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone both respectful and measured, "the documents you have presented paint a damning picture of financial impropriety and criminal collusion. The ledger with Lord Devonshire's signature, the secret accounts, the correspondence with shadowy figures. They all corroborate the suspicions that have haunted this family for years." Holmes replied, "Inspector, the web of deceit spun by the Devonshire family extended far beyond mere embezzlement. It involved bribery, the silencing of dissent through coercion, and even an untimely death that was conveniently swept under the rug. Our work here is not solely about the recovery of funds, it is about restoring justice to those who have suffered under this regime." Lestrade's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. It appears that, in exposing these transgressions, Miss Devonshire has become both a catalyst and a martyr for truth. Her disappearance, her reappearance, and the evidence she left behind have all conspired to bring about this moment. We must act swiftly to ensure that those who orchestrated this corruption are held accountable. News of the scandal spread rapidly throughout the county. Local newspapers, previously enamoured by the glamour of the Devonshire name, now ran headlines that screamed of betrayal, financial fraud, and a vanishing heiress who had returned to claim her birthright. The public's mood was one of righteous indignation, and demands for justice grew louder by the hour. A press conference was arranged in the manor's ancient courtyard. a setting that, under normal circumstances, would have hosted elegant garden parties rather than a public denunciation of long-hidden crimes. Holmes, flanked by Inspector Lestrade and Watson, addressed a throng of reporters and local dignitaries. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying clearly over the assembled crowd, "today we stand at the crossroads of history. The truth, once obscured by greed and deception, now shines forth. The evidence we have gathered demonstrates that the legacy of the Devonshire name has been built upon lies and criminal enterprise. Justice is not a mere abstraction. It is a right that must be defended, no matter the cost." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and cameras flashed as reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Among the audience, Miss Eleanor watched from a discreet distance, her gaze fixed on the man whose reputation had been forged through the relentless pursuit of truth. Though the public did not yet know the full extent of her sacrifice, the seeds of change had been sown, and the people's faith in justice was beginning to blossom anew. Inside the manor, the confrontation that had begun the day's events continued on a more personal level. In private chambers and secluded parlours, members of the Devonshire family were forced to confront the enormity of their actions. Lord Gerald, his pride shattered, was escorted to a private holding cell arranged within the manor's secure wing, a temporary measure until he could be transferred to official custody. In a small, dimly lit room, Edward sat alone, his eyes red from grief and remorse. He knew that he had been complicit in many of the decisions that had led to the family's downfall, even if his role had been more passive than that of his domineering brother. Now, with every secret exposed and every lie laid bare, Edward was left to ponder whether redemption was even possible for a man so steeped in regret. Lady Margaret, ever the stoic matriarch, retreated to the manor's chapel, a modest room that had seen the best and worst of the family's fortunes. There, among the flickering candlelight and the quiet echoes of whispered prayers, she wrestled with her conscience. Have we become so entangled in our own ambition that we have lost sight of what is truly honourable? She murmured softly to herself. In that moment, she resolved to do everything in her power to mend the shattered remnants of their legacy, even if it meant facing the judgment of both society and her own conscience. Mr. Worthington, too, bore the heavy burden of guilt. He spent hours alone in a study, poring over the documents he had helped to conceal and the memories of a past that he now wished he could erase. His confession had been a necessary step toward atonement, but the road to redemption was long and arduous. "I have been a pawn in a game far larger than myself," he admitted to Watson one evening, his voice heavy with remorse. "But now, I must accept the consequences of my actions and help ensure that no one else falls victim to this treachery." The legal process was swift. With the damning evidence in hand, local prosecutors wasted no time in pressing charges against those implicated in the crimes at Devonshire Manor. Hearings were held in a packed courtroom, where the evidence was laid out in stark detail for the public to witness. The trial became a focal point of the community's demand for accountability, a shining beacon of the fact that even the mightiest could fall when their sins were brought to light. Holmes was called upon as an expert witness, his testimony a masterful recounting of how each piece of evidence fit together like a meticulously constructed puzzle. The ledger entries, the hidden correspondence, the secret accounts, they are irrefutable, he declared to the courtroom. They reveal a pattern of deception and abuse that was enabled by the unchecked power of one man and his accomplices. It is only by acknowledging these transgressions that we can begin to heal and build a future founded on integrity. The prosecution's case was bolstered not only by Holmes' testimony, but also by the detailed accounts provided by the servants, whose quiet courage in speaking out had turned the tide of public opinion. Mrs. Wilkins and Mr. Fairweather testified about the clandestine meetings and the whispered conspiracies that had long haunted the manor's corridors. Their voices, though soft, carried the weight of years spent in silent complicity, and now they spoke with the clarity of those who had finally found the strength to break their silence. As the trial progressed, the courtroom transformed into a theatre of moral reckoning. Each revelation was met with gasps and murmurs from the public, and the faces of the accused grew increasingly pale as the evidence mounted. Lord Gerald, his once imperious demeanour now reduced to that of a broken man, could offer no defence against the incontrovertible proof of his misdeeds. Even those who had been reluctant participants in the corruption found themselves ensnared in the net of truth. Outside the courtroom, the community grappled with the implications of what had transpired. Neighbours who had once admired the Devonshire family now expressed dismay and disbelief. In local pubs and on the streets of nearby villages, people debated the nature of power and privilege, and how easily both could be corrupted when unchecked by conscience. The scandal had become a mirror reflecting not only the failings of one family, but also the broader societal responsibility to uphold truth and justice. For Holmes and Watson, the case had been an exercise in both intellectual rigour and profound moral reflection. In the quiet moments that followed the trial, as they walked along the fog-shrouded streets of London, Watson remarked, "Holmes, in all our years of chasing down criminals and solving mysteries, rarely have I encountered a case that strikes so deeply at the heart of human frailty. This affair with the Devonshire family, this intricate web of betrayal and redemption, has changed me in ways I can scarcely articulate." Holmes, his gaze distant as he recalled the events that had unfolded, replied, "The pursuit of truth is a double-edged sword, Watson. It cuts away the layers of deception that shield us from reality, but in doing so, it exposes the raw, unvarnished essence of humanity." Miss Eleanor's actions, though extreme, were born out of an unyielding desire to purify a legacy that had long been tainted by greed. In that sense, her sacrifice serves as both a warning and a beacon. We must remain ever vigilant, for the price of justice is often paid in blood and sorrow. As the legal proceedings drew to a close, a new era began to take shape at Devonshire Manor. With the corrupt elements removed and the truth on public display, the community and the surviving members of the family were left with the daunting task of rebuilding not only the physical estate, but also the trust that had been so grievously broken. In the wake of the trial, initiatives were set in motion to reform local governance and to ensure that the lessons learned from this scandal would never be forgotten. Lady Margaret, determined to honour her niece's legacy and to restore dignity to the family name, spearheaded efforts to open the manor to the public as a museum and a centre for historical research. "Let our past be a lesson for the future," she declared in a public address, her voice resonating with both sorrow and hope. "May we never again allow ambition to blind us to our moral obligations." Mr. Worthington, who had accepted full responsibility for his part in the conspiracy, dedicated himself to charitable work in the community, channeling his remorse into acts of service that sought to repair the damage done. And Edward, quietly bearing the weight of his own guilt, resolved to live a life of humility and service, using his experience to counsel others on the dangers of unchecked ambition. Even Inspector Lestrade, who had once been a steadfast enforcer of the law, found himself reflecting on the broader implications of the case. "Justice must not only be served, it must be seen to be served," he commented during a press briefing. "Today, we have witnessed the triumph of truth over deception, but let it also be a reminder that the vigilance of the public and the integrity of our institutions are our greatest defences against the corrupting influence of power." In the weeks that followed the tumultuous events at Devonshire Manor, Holmes and Watson returned to their familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street. The case had taken its toll on both men, its intellectual challenges and moral complexities weighing heavily on their hearts. In the quiet of their sitting room, as they sat by the fire and sipped on tea, Watson reflected on the extraordinary events that had unfolded. "Holmes," he began softly, "I have chronicled many adventures in my time, but never have I witnessed a case where the line between justice and sacrifice was so profoundly blurred. Miss Eleanor's plan, her orchestrated disappearance, was an act of courage and despair all at once. It has changed the way I view the cost of truth." Holmes, his expression thoughtful beneath the flickering light, replied, "Indeed, Watson. In our pursuit of justice, we must sometimes traverse a landscape where morality is not black and white, but a shifting mosaic of choices made under duress. The Devonshire affair has taught us that even those born into privilege can become prisoners of their own sins, and that redemption, though hard-won, is never entirely out of reach. For a long moment, the two friends sat in silence, contemplating the delicate balance between light and shadow, a balance that defined not only their work, but the very nature of human existence. And though the scars of the past would remain as indelible reminders of the price of truth, there was also the promise of renewal, a promise that the light of justice, once kindled, could guide even the most broken souls toward redemption. In a private ceremony held in the restored gardens of Devonshire Manor, Miss Eleanor, no longer hidden behind a veil of mystery, addressed a small gathering of survivors, reformers, and community leaders. Her speech, delivered with measured dignity and a quiet determination, encapsulated the lessons of the past and the hope for the future. "My friends," she began, her voice steady and sincere, "for years I lived in the shadows, orchestrating an escape not from fear alone, but from a legacy that had become toxic. I faked my disappearance so that the truth, long suppressed by greed and corruption, might come to light. Today, as we stand together on the threshold of a new beginning, let us honor the memory of those who suffered under the weight of deception and vow never again to allow power to go unchecked. May this be the dawn of an era defined not by our past transgressions, but by our commitment to justice, integrity, and compassion." Her words resonated deeply with all who were present. They understood that the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but they also recognized that from the ashes of scandal, a new, brighter legacy could be forged, one that was built on truth, accountability, and a shared vision for a better tomorrow. As autumn gave way to the gentle promise of winter, Devonshire Manor slowly emerged from its long period of darkness. The corridors that had once harboured the whispers of conspiracy now echoed with the determined footsteps of those committed to rebuilding what had been lost. The local community, galvanized by the exposure of long-hidden crimes, united in efforts to promote transparency and reform at every level of governance. In time, the story of the vanishing heiress became legend, a reminder that even in the heart of darkness, a single act of defiance can ignite a spark that transforms an entire legacy. Holmes and Watson, their work at the manor concluded, resumed their quiet life at Baker Street, forever changed by the case that had tested the very limits of human morality. Holmes reflected, "There are mysteries in this world that extend beyond the simple resolution of a crime. They force us to confront our own failings and to strive for a higher purpose." Miss Eleanor's disappearance was not an end, but a beginning, a clarion call for accountability that will echo through the ages. Watson added, "And it reminds us that, as detectives of both the criminal and the human condition, our greatest challenge is to see beyond the facade of wealth and power, and to recognize the truth hidden in every shadow." Thus, as the final pages of this chapter of the Devonshire saga were written, the legacy of corruption was supplanted by a promise of renewal. The sacrifices made, the secrets revealed, and the courage exhibited by one determined heiress had forever altered the course of a family and a community. In the cold light of justice, the truth had triumphed, and with it, the hope of a future built on honour and redemption. Chapter 5. The dawn of redemption, the bitter winter that had descended on Devonshire Manor, finally began to yield to the gentle caress of early spring. Pale sunlight filtered through frost-kissed panes, casting long, hopeful beams across the newly cleansed corridors of the ancient estate. It was in this fragile moment of transition that the survivors of the once dismal legacy gathered to contemplate a future defined not by guilt and corruption, but by renewal and accountability. The trials and tribulations that had engulfed the manor now gave way to the promise of rebirth, a promise echoed by the resolute hearts of those determined to rise above the sins of the past. In the wake of the sweeping investigation led by Inspector Lestrade and the compelling testimony of Sherlock Holmes, the people of the county had rallied around the cause of justice. Local magistrates, reform-minded officials, and members of the community, inspired by the public reckoning at Devonshire Manor, embarked on a collective effort to institute measures that would ensure transparency and accountability for generations to come. A town meeting was convened in the estate's expansive courtyard, a space once used solely for aristocratic celebrations, but now repurposed for the common good. Citizens, emboldened by the revelations that had shattered the long-held myth of the infallible Devonshire name, spoke passionately of the need for systemic change. At the centre of the gathering, standing at a makeshift podium, was Lady Margaret, who had become the quiet force behind the new direction of her family's legacy. "My dear friends and neighbours," she began, her voice resonating with both sorrow and strength. "Today, we witness the dawn of a new era. The dark deeds of our past have been exposed, and with them, the foundations of our former way of life crumble. Let us honour the sacrifice of Miss Eleanor and all those who suffered under this corrupt regime by forging a future built on the pillars of honesty, justice, and compassion." The crowd responded with measured applause, a mixture of relief and determination that filled the air. Among the listeners were many whose lives had been touched by the scandal. A community that had grown wary of unchecked power now embraced the opportunity to shape a future that could truly be called their own. Meanwhile, inside the solemn confines of the county courthouse, the legal machinery that had been set in motion in the aftermath of the Devonshire scandal was reaching its final act. In a packed courtroom that had become the stage for one of the most consequential trials in recent memory, Lord Gerald Devonshire and his closest accomplices faced charges that spanned corruption, embezzlement, and the tragic murder that had haunted the family's history. Sherlock Holmes, whose methodical dissection of evidence had led to this moment, took the stand as an expert witness. His testimony was precise, his recollection of every detail unerring, and his words carried the weight of undeniable truth. The ledger entries, he declared, addressing both the judge and the assembly of citizens, documented financial transactions that were deliberately concealed for nefarious purposes. Coupled with testimonies from long-suffering servants and corroborated by intercepted correspondence, these documents reveal a network of criminal activity that spanned years. Inspector Lestrade nodded gravely from his seat, the lines of his weathered face deepening with the burden of responsibility. It is our duty, as custodians of the law, to ensure that those who abuse their power are held to account. Justice, though delayed, must be executed impartially. After days of intense legal proceedings, the final verdict was pronounced. Lord Gerald and several of his confidants were sentenced to lengthy terms behind bars. The charges, extensive and damning, left no room for doubt in the minds of the public or the court. The judgment was met with a collective sigh, a mixture of catharsis and hope, as the community recognized that the era of impunity was drawing to a close. In a quiet moment after the sentencing, Mr. Worthington, his eyes heavy with remorse, approached Inspector Lestrade. "I realize now that I was ensnared by a web far larger than I ever imagined," he murmured. "I accept full responsibility for my actions and pledge to assist in any way possible to make amends for the wrongs I have committed." His words, though soft, carried the sincerity of a man seeking redemption. A sentiment echoed in the subdued applause from those who recognized the human capacity for change. With the legal storm receding and the public's attention turning toward healing and restoration, Miss Eleanor Devonshire stepped forward once again. No longer content to linger in the shadows, she emerged as a champion for reform and an advocate for those who had suffered in silence. In an open forum organised by the new governing council of the manor, she addressed the community directly, her tone both earnest and inspiring. "I faked my disappearance because I could not stand by as our legacy was tarnished by greed and moral decay," she said, her eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. "Every clue I left behind, every coded message, was designed to force the truth into the light. I did what I believed was necessary to save not just our family name, but the very soul of our community. Today, I ask you to join me. not in dwelling on our past transgressions, but in building a future defined by accountability, compassion, and shared responsibility. Her words stirred the hearts of those present, igniting discussions that lasted well into the evening. Many saw in her a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when forced into extreme measures, the pursuit of justice can lead to a brighter tomorrow. Her public reconciliation marked a turning point for the manor, transforming it from a monument of shame into a beacon of hope. In the months that followed the trial and the public reckoning, Devonshire Manor underwent a transformation that reflected the community's commitment to renewal. Under the guidance of Lady Margaret and with the support of civic leaders, the manor was restored not as a private residence steeped in the sins of its past, but as a public institution dedicated to learning, art, and the preservation of history. The newly established Devonshire Heritage Centre was inaugurated with great fanfare. It housed exhibits detailing the history of the estate, the rise and fall of its family, and, most importantly, a section dedicated to the lessons learned from the scandal. Photographs, original documents, and interactive displays allowed visitors to witness firsthand how a community could come together in the face of corruption, learn from its mistakes, and rebuild trust. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were invited to speak at the centre's opening ceremony. Holmes, ever modest despite his legendary status, emphasised the importance of vigilance. "Truth is the foundation upon which a just society is built," he stated, his gaze sweeping across the audience. Let this centre serve as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed facades can be dismantled when we commit ourselves to uncovering and upholding the truth. Watson, his voice warm and reflective, added, "May the legacy of Devonshire Manor now be one of redemption, a testament to the fact that from the deepest darkness, light may emerge, guiding us to a future where integrity and compassion prevail." Within the walls of the manor, personal journeys of redemption unfolded quietly. Edward, once tormented by guilt, began working alongside local charities, counselling youths about the perils of unchecked ambition and the importance of ethical living. His transformation, though gradual, was marked by a sincerity that touched those around him. He often recalled the fateful days when he had silently borne witness to his family's crimes and vowed never to let the sins of the past define his future. Mr. Worthington, having accepted his role in the tragedy with a humility that surprised even himself, dedicated his efforts to community service. He established a foundation aimed at aiding those who had been exploited by corrupt financial practices, a means to ensure that others would not fall prey to the same pitfalls that had ensnared him. In time, his actions earned him a measure of forgiveness and respect from those who once viewed him with suspicion. For Lady Margaret, the journey was perhaps the most bittersweet. As the matriarch who had borne the weight of family honour for so long, she now found herself tasked with guiding the surviving members of the family toward a future defined by honesty. In quiet moments spent in the restored chapel of the manor, she prayed not only for forgiveness for past transgressions, but also for the strength to rebuild a legacy that would honour the sacrifices made by those who had suffered. "We cannot change our past," she whispered one evening, "but we can shape our future. Let our actions from this day forward be a tribute to the truth." Miss Eleanor, whose daring plan had set in motion the chain of events leading to this moment of renewal, resolved to remain a tireless advocate for reform. Her life, once defined by the pain of betrayal and the shock of her own drastic measures, now took on a new purpose. Travelling between Devonshire Manor and the broader community, she spoke at schools, civic organisations and public forums, urging others to remain vigilant in the fight against corruption. "Our duty," she would say, "is to build a world where truth is celebrated and justice is the norm, not the exception." After all that had transpired, Holmes and Watson found solace in their modest lodgings at 221B Baker Street, a sanctuary that had borne witness to countless adventures and moral dilemmas. Over a quiet cup of tea in the early morning hours, the two friends reflected on the profound transformation wrought by the Devonshire affair. Watson, gazing thoughtfully into the flame of the hearth, remarked, "Holmes, I have seen many cases in our time, but none has carried the weight of human frailty and redemption quite like this one. It is as though the very nature of our existence has been distilled into these events. The endless struggle between light and darkness, and the eternal hope that truth will ultimately prevail." Holmes, his eyes softening as he regarded his faithful companion, responded, "Indeed, Watson. The case of the vanishing heiress taught us that even the most elaborate deceptions, when unraveled, reveal the capacity for change in every human heart. It is a reminder that justice is not an abstract ideal, but a living, breathing force that demands our constant vigilance. And now, as we rest from our labours, we can take solace in the knowledge that a legacy once steeped in corruption has begun to transform into one of hope and renewal." The two men sat in reflective silence, their minds filled with the echoes of a case that had reshaped lives, altered destinies, and ultimately proven that even in the darkest of times, redemption was possible. As spring matured into a vibrant summer, Devonshire Manor stood as a testament to the resilience of truth. The estate, once marred by the sins of its forebears, now buzzed with activity, a centre for cultural exchange, education, and community service. Children laughed in the newly landscaped gardens, while elders recounted the lessons of history in quiet, sunlit rooms. At the centre of this transformation, Miss Eleanor continued her work with a gentle determination. In an interview with a local newspaper, she was asked about the personal cost of her actions. "I sacrificed a part of myself to unearth a truth that many wished to hide," she confessed. "But I believe that true change requires sacrifice. The legacy of Devonshire is now in the hands of a community that understands the value of integrity. I am not proud of the pain that was endured, but I am hopeful that it has paved the way for a future where honesty is cherished above all else." Her words resonated deeply with those who had come to see her not as a mysterious vanishing heiress, but as a courageous agent of transformation. The story of her faked disappearance, once a scandalous secret whispered in hushed tones, had become a powerful symbol of the lengths to which one must sometimes go to ensure that justice prevails. On a bright morning marked by the jubilant song of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves, a celebration was held in the Manor's Grand Hall. The newly established Devonshire Heritage Centre officially opened its doors to the public, inviting visitors to learn from the past and to participate in the building of a better future. Amid the crowd, old adversaries and former collaborators mingled, united by the shared goal of transforming pain into progress. Inspector Lestrade, now a respected figure in the community's reform efforts, delivered a brief address. "Today is not a day of triumph over one family, but a victory for every citizen who believes that justice can triumph over corruption. Let this moment remind us that accountability, transparency, and compassion are the cornerstones of a society that truly values its people." As applause filled the hall, Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the long, winding path they had traversed together. Their adventures had taken them from the foggy streets of London to the hidden corridors of a centuries-old manor, and now they bore witness to the transformation of a legacy that had once seemed irredeemable. In the soft glow of twilight, as the day's celebrations waned and the manor's lights twinkled like beacons of hope against the encroaching dusk, Holmes and Watson strolled through the garden. The air was filled with the fragrance of blooming roses and the gentle hum of life renewed. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "we have seen much in our time. Yet few cases leave as indelible a mark on the soul as the one we have witnessed here. It is a testament to the power of human resilience and the capacity for even the most tarnished legacy to be reborn in the light of truth." Watson nodded, his heart lightened by the vision of a future where justice was not a distant ideal, but a living reality. And it is a reminder, Holmes, that in every shadow there exists the possibility of redemption, a chance to rewrite the narrative and to build a legacy founded on integrity. As the two friends parted ways that evening, each carried with them the enduring lesson that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually emerge, and that the human spirit, when guided by the light of justice, can overcome even the darkest of legacies. Years later, the tale of the vanishing heiress would become an integral chapter in the annals of Devonshire history. A story told to remind future generations that redemption is possible even in the face of overwhelming darkness. In classrooms and community centres alike, the transformation of Devonshire Manor served as a living parable, one that championed transparency, accountability, and the courage to confront one's own past. A statue of Miss Eleanor was erected in the manor's central courtyard, a graceful figure with eyes fixed on the horizon, symbolising the eternal quest for truth and the hope that springs from even the deepest of sacrifices. Alongside the statue, an inscription read, "In darkness we may falter, but with truth as our guide, even the greatest of legacies may be reborn in the light of redemption." The statue became a pilgrimage site for those seeking inspiration, a place where visitors could reflect on the transformative power of honesty and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In a quiet archive within the Devonshire Heritage Centre, a meticulously preserved diary, Miss Eleanor's final testament, rested for posterity. Its pages, filled with a blend of sorrow, resolve, and unwavering hope, were a testament to the journey from deception to truth and from despair to redemption. Historians, scholars, and curious minds would study its contents for decades to come, drawing inspiration from the courage of a young heiress who had dared to challenge a legacy built on lies. And so, as the seasons turned and the years flowed onward, the story of the vanishing heiress remained a symbol of what can be achieved when one refuses to be complicit in silence. It was a tale that transcended the boundaries of one family, speaking to the universal truth that even the most entrenched darkness can give way to the dawning light of a new beginning.